Coming up on the Threat Status Podcast, we talk to Johnathon Miller, Vice President of Security Operations at Lumifi Cyber, about the evolution of ransomware attacks, U.S. offensive cyber operations, and much more. And we dive into the fallout in the U.S.-Ukraine relationship after last week's dramatic Oval Office meeting between President Trump and Ukrainian President Zelensky. And we talk about the White House's proposal to build a new Office of Shipbuilding, and much more. Don't forget to go to WashingtonTimes.com and sign up for the daily Threat Status newsletter. Hello and welcome to the Threat Status Podcast. I'm your host, Ben Wolfgang, national security correspondent at the Washington Times, and I'm joined, as always, by my esteemed co-host, Guy Taylor, the national security editor here at the Times. And this episode of the Threat Status Weekly Podcast is brought to you by L3 Harris. Moving fast requires trust, and moving forward requires disruption. Explore their cutting-edge technologies currently in production and designed for today's fighter pilots by visiting l3harris.com. L3 Harris, power defense with the trusted disruptor. A really newsy show today, Guy. A lot to get into, including some of our reaction to President Trump's speech to Congress this week, and a great interview with Johnathon Miller of Lumifi Cyber, all about ransomware, offensive cyber operations, and a lot more. So stay tuned for that. But before we get to it, as always, Guy, first things first, what's on your radar right now?
Thanks, Ben. Great to be on with you for another week here. There's so much going on. I'm closely tracking the Ukraine situation and the ongoing fallout from the Oval Office imbroglio between Ukrainian President Zelensky and President Trump. That was on February 28th. It was less than a week ago from our taping this episode, but it feels like several months ago, Ben. Trump faced a wave of really critical mainstream media coverage over his handling of that meeting. I've tried to look at the situation soberly and identify a few narratives. One is very simple, Ben. Trump wants to end the current violence in Ukraine. And to reach that end, he wants to position himself as the most influential negotiator or deal maker. And to achieve that position, he can't be a bidder for Zelensky if Zelensky's position is that Kiev won't budge or cede any territory to Russia and Vladimir Putin. At the same time, to emerge as the leader of negotiations, Ben, Trump has to placate Putin, even if that means being accused of being a tool for Putin. Again here, I'm trying to look at it soberly. In the aftermath of the Trump-Zelensky blowup, CIA Director John Ratcliffe confirmed that Trump had put a pause not only on U.S. military aid to Ukraine, but also U.S. intelligence sharing with Kiev. We're talking things like signal satellite spying on Russian military asset positions. This is a heavy move, and it could be very dangerous for Ukraine. What's interesting and what hasn't got a lot of mainstream media attention is how Ratcliffe, during an interview on Fox on March 5, tried to explain Trump's reasoning for this move. He basically said Trump is trying to pressure Zelensky into being more cooperative with Trump's push to get a ceasefire and open some kind of a negotiation to end the war. That's a pretty bald and simple explanation, Ben. Here's the question. Has it worked? If you look at what Zelensky has been saying in the aftermath of that February 28 Oval Office blowup, the answer is maybe. Zelensky put out a long statement on March 4, basically saying he's now as ready as ever to work with Trump to move quickly to get a ceasefire and end of war negotiations, and that he still wants very badly to ink a major rare earths mineral mining deal with the United States. Where will all of that lead now? We're tracking it at Threat Status, Ben. One thing I will note is that in the aftermath of the messy White House meeting, it is fair to ask whether it really was necessary for Trump and JD Vance and some friend of theirs who was standing among reporters to gang up on Zelensky for not wearing a suit when Elon Musk regularly shows up at the White House without a suit on.
Elon Musk, for the record, did have a suit on at Trump's speech to Congress on Tuesday night, which I noticed right away.
That's right. And Saturday Night Live had a field day with this one little detail. My point here is that I actually want to note that European leaders have also responded to Trump's tactics by rallying together and vowing to increase their own contributions of military and other aid to Kiev. Isn't that what Joe Biden wanted? Particularly given the estimate that the U.S. has fronted nearly 50% of all the aid for Ukraine since Russia invaded. Hasn't it been a goal of U.S. hawks going back to Barack Obama for Europe's wealthier nations, France, Germany, and so on, to pick up some serious slack and take the lead in European security against Russia? The question is, does Trump have the wherewithal to keep U.S. military support on the table and not swing the pendulum so feverishly that it actually does do long-term damage to the U.S.-Europe transatlantic security bedrock of the post-World War II era? I digress again here, Ben. These are all questions we're grappling with in the daily threat status newsletter.
It's interesting. I guess this does give or lend some credence to the argument made by Trump and others that Europe does have room. They can do more. That Britain and France could send peacekeeping troops to Ukraine if they wanted to. So that does sort of form the backbone of what Trump's been saying for a long time is what they really need is just kind of a kick into high gear.
That's all debatable, Ben, but I think it's important to take a sober look at it. One other item I want to touch on was the revelation in recent days of the arrest of Mohammed Sharifullah, the man U.S. authorities say was involved in the suicide bombing that killed 13 American troops and more than 160 Afghans during the 2021 U.S. withdrawal from Afghanistan. There are some details about this arrest that need highlighting. The first is that Sharifullah was taken into custody along the Pakistan-Afghanistan border region, a hotbed of activity for the Islamic State Khorasan group, or ISIS-K, and the operation involved Pakistani security forces. This is key because it indicates a level of U.S.-Pakistan counterterrorism coordination that we basically haven't seen in more than a decade, since before May 2011, when U.S. Special Forces secretly flew helicopters into Pakistan to capture and kill Osama bin Laden at a hideout right around the corner from Pakistan's top military academy. So maybe U.S.-Pakistan coordination is back on track now. Another thing notable here, Ben, is that Sharifullah, according to the U.S. Justice Department, told FBI agents after his capture that he also had a role in the ISIS-K attack last year that killed 130 people at a Moscow concert hall. I hope listeners will go to the threat status pages at the Washington Times. We link to the FBI affidavit and have some nice deep dive analysis on all of this, Ben.
Yeah, it's a fascinating case, and we're going to have a little bit more later in the show on the domestic terror threats the U.S. and its allies are facing right now. Guy, you mentioned Trump's speech to Congress this week, and he said a lot of newsworthy things, but one that jumped out to me is he said the administration will create a White House office of shipbuilding. He said, quote, "We are also going to resurrect the American shipbuilding industry, including commercial shipbuilding and military shipbuilding," unquote. He said this will include special tax incentives to bring this industry home to America. It's important to note that he did say explicitly this is commercial and military shipbuilding, but the line can get a little blurry between the two sides of that coin when you consider U.S. competition economically, geopolitically, and militarily with China, which of course has its own major shipbuilding industry that, according to some estimates, has built as many as half or maybe even more of all of merchant vessels in the world right now currently at sea. So think about that for a minute to put this whole thing in context. On the military side specifically, China, of course, has more ships than the U.S. Sometimes it's tough to know exact specific numbers on any given day because of planned retirements, decommissioning, repairs, and other factors. But a comprehensive report last year from the Center for Strategic and International Studies, a Washington think tank that Guy and I often rely on for information, said that China has the largest maritime fighting force in the world, operating 234 warships to the U.S. Navy's 219. Now, the U.S. does have a major shipbuilding initiative in the works right now and hopes to grow the fleet significantly. By the 2050s, the Pentagon hopes to grow the fleet to nearly 400. But critics still say we're not moving fast enough and that the rate of ships coming online isn't enough right now to match the ships being retired. And you may remember that last week on this show, Robert Greenway of the Heritage Foundation strongly suggested that's part of the reason why former Chief of Naval Operations Admiral Lisa Franchetti was fired by President Trump. She was part of the group of Pentagon officers fired, the highest profile, of course, being General C.Q. Brown, the former chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. Now, Franchetti hadn't even been on the job for a full 2 years, but critics say she wasn't aggressive enough in countering China's perceived naval advantage. Though we should note here, as our friend of the show and colleague Bill Gertz will often point out, there is a quality versus quantity debate here. Are China's ships as good as ours? Probably not. Still, this Office of Shipbuilding caught my eye because it's a really tangible step. I mean, it's somewhat similar, to the proposal for an Iron Dome for America. It's a recognition that there's a big deficiency in a specific area right now in U.S. defense and military capabilities as it relates directly to competition with China. And this is a direct response to that. So we'll see where the Office of Shipbuilding goes and what its actual accomplishments are over the next, 3+ years of the Trump administration. One more thing here, Guy, before we get on to our great interview with Johnathon Miller of Lumifi Cyber. He talks about a few things that perhaps, some of our listeners or any of us really, myself included, who aren't knee deep in the cybersecurity and ransomware worlds may not necessarily fully understand. He talks about, for example, APT groups, which are advanced persistent threat groups that carry out attacks on countries' national security assets or high value organizations. He mentions MDR services, meaning managed detection and response, to identify and limit the damage from cyber threats. He references specific types of ransomware and ransomware organizations. Conti ransomware, for example, is a type of malware attack that the federal government says has been used in more than 400 attacks on U.S. and international organizations. He also talks about Revel ransomware, which is associated with a notorious cyber crime gang. And sometimes the line's pretty blurry between the type of ransomware or malware itself and the perpetrators of using it. So we get into all of this in a lot more detail, but just as a little bit of a primer, I wanted you all to have some of that context. So with that said, let's get to our interview now with Johnathon Miller. And we are joined now by Johnathon Miller. He is the VP of Security Operations at Lumifi Cyber. Johnathon, thank you so much for joining us here on the Threat Status Podcast. For our listeners, if you could, just really quickly, give us a quick rundown of Lumifi and what you all do over there.
Yeah, absolutely. So thanks, Ben, for the intro and Guy for having me on here today. Lumifi provides MDR services for a lot of different types of vectors. Kind of are a one-stop shop for cybersecurity services, kind of extending the arm or the olive branch to different consumers in different types of vectors and industries. With that, I run our security operations center here at Lumifi. So everything under that MDR service is under my purview.
Well, I want to start here, Johnathon, with the Russia-Ukraine war and its relation to ransomware, because I know this is something that you're especially interested in. And I think it's something that a lot of our listeners will find interesting as well. And kind of off the bat, for folks who may not be familiar, maybe you can just give us a brief definition of what a ransomware attack is, and then specifically with respect to Russia and Ukraine, how it's been used in that conflict and how it's sort of evolved now in the 3+ years since it started.
how ransomware starts as a phishing attempt in some sort of fashion. From there, a phishing attempt will get access to some sort of account or host and kind of get into that environment. And then they will drop a piece of malware. That malware is directly indicative of a ransomware event. And what it's essentially doing is it's encrypting all of the data of what it can touch. So it's encrypting all of the files. It's encrypting all of the network shares inside of a company's network. All their proprietary information is all becoming encrypted. And then it's only able to be decrypted by a key that the threat actor provides.
So with respect to how this is playing out, ransomware in the Russia-Ukraine war, I think it's kind of a subplot that maybe some folks aren't as familiar with, but I know it's something you've been tracking. What's the connection between this conflict and ransomware as you see it right now?
Yeah, absolutely. So, I mean, in general speaking, the biggest country that is associated to ransomware, ironically, is Russia. So they have a lot of the large threat groups. So when you think of kind of looking at ransomware and you look at all of the large name brand threat groups like Revel, Conti, Lockbit, they're typically associated with Russia or Russia state actors. Now, they can be prevalent in other locations, but they're supported in that same exact group. And a lot of that has to do with just purely the idea of threat actors aren't entirely being looked at as hard as they are in other countries and being aware of it. It's a little bit like kind of turning a blind eye to it inside of Russia. And so a lot of the threat actors and a lot of the big events are actually originating from that. Once you start with a Russian-Ukrainian war and you have a barrier or a kind of neighboring country that is close to that area where some of those groups are actually associated with or born in Ukraine or any other places surrounding that area, what that essentially turned into and kind of transformed is ransomware used to be this financially motivated activity where people were really just looking for a quick score, a quick kind of money grab, essentially. They would encrypt the files. They were a very well-run business. They would pull those files off, and then they would say, hey, if you guys want the files back or you want the decryption, go ahead and just pay us. We'll send it back to you. That evolved kind of towards we'll keep the files. So even if you kind of rebranded or re-imaged those machines and got the data back or had it stored somewhere else, they could still release that information. So that was purely just a financial transactional relationship. When the Russia-Ukraine conflict happened, what that essentially turned into was you started seeing a little bit of organized crime groups and financial motivated groups kind of blur the line between those nation state attacks and state sponsored attacks and the criminal activity. And so what they were really doing is they were trying to align with those geopolitical barriers and saying, hey, we're going to stand with, this specific area. And then we're going to target what we think is the right thing to do in their eyes. And so that what that really did was it caused kind of a disruption in ransomware operations for quite a bit of groups. If you kind of look at Conti, for example, they were a major ransomware group that had major implication in high profile attacks. Because of their public declaration of support for Russia, they actually had people just share their notes and their playbooks and really leak those internal chats between their internal operations. And so what that essentially turned into is it became a kind of a damage control for them because the group ultimately shut down because there was such internal conflict in mid-2022 that was directly in relations to that conflict.
Jonathan, I think the question that might be on some folks' minds as you say that is that this idea of the blurring of lines between nation state and sort of criminal activity. Is that essentially to say that, Vladimir Putin, the Kremlin, that Russia as a country, as an entity, as a military, do they view some of these ransomware groups as sort of extensions of them, as weapons that they can wield against their enemy, in this case, Ukraine, for example?
Yeah, so I think that's definitely a part of that for sure. I don't know if I want to necessarily say it's a hidden message of saying like, hey, we'll turn the blind eye. If you guys are doing this for your own, financial gain, then you guys can do that state sponsored and kind of help us and assist in that area. That's definitely something that occurs, across the world entirely in all the APT groups, et cetera. But yes, absolutely. They utilize that those threat groups and those threat actors to essentially accomplish some of their goals. I mean, one of the groups that was responsible for the defacement of that Ukrainian government website was directly associated with a Russia-backed APT group, and so 100% they view it as a way to disrupt for financial gain. There's other countries that do it for different reasons. Like China technically is not a huge ransomware group. They have some, connections with it, but they're really looking for like espionage, for example, and not really focus on that ransomware style of attack. So they're really just trying to grab information and things like that.
Jonathan, it's Guy Taylor. I want to throw kind of a curveball at you. Everything you're saying is very interesting, but I feel like there's never enough discussion about U.S. offensive cyber capabilities. And our top NatSec tech correspondent, Ryan Lovelace, did some reporting recently about the alleged hack by specifically the NSA of a Chinese university. There's this old adage that the best defense is good offense, right? So whether we're talking about Russian cyber attackers or a Chinese backed group that's stealing American intellectual property or Americans' data, what's the best way for the U.S. to proactively go after those bad actors? And what can you tell us from your perch about what the U.S. capabilities are for that?
I think a lot of people forget that the U.S. is also an APT group. They're one of the largest APT groups, in fact. And it's kind of an interesting topic to talk about, because everybody thinks of like the threat actors, APT groups, are in these countries that are much more, prevalent to United States and Western, civilization, because that's where we're getting the information from, and kind of that like propaganda. But the NSA, they constantly are doing, information grabs. A lot of that information is hidden, but some of the things get, pulled out. Controversial topic is the Snowden release of information and how that's really played a role in kind of exposing some of that information. Good, bad, and indifferent. All of that stuff, it did play a role. But they're constantly, trying to disrupt the ability of, threat actors to try to minimize the impact and fight back, essentially.
So are there private entities that engage in offensive hacking for the U.S. government?
That is definitely happening. I don't have too much information on it and kind of who those groups are.
It is an incredibly sensitive area. We did a whole section at Billington Cybersecurity last year where we asked like a dozen, cyber company representatives on the floor this question, and there are people who seem to know about it, but it's a really secretive space.
Yeah, absolutely. In the US, you're not going to get a lot of that information branded. You see kind of the FBI playing a little part in disbanding some of these organizations, and that definitely happens, like Lockbit, for example. But at the same time, like, we're trying to get the information as well on our side, and our APT groups, while they have some sort of rules and regulations that are a little bit more stringent than, say, a Russian state actor or state group, sponsored group, it still is something that plays a key role in our ability to defend this information.
Jonathan, on a somewhat related note, I mean, how, we talk about some of these groups, and I guess I'm guilty of this as well, as, it's a Russian hacking group or a Russian ransomware group or a Chinese hacking group or Iranians, North Koreans, etc. But how multinational or transnational are some of these groups? I assume that they don't necessarily fit into the neat geographical boundaries of one particular country or another.
Oh, no, 100%. Conti is a perfect example of that. There's Russian and Ukrainian in the same group that was completely, disbanded essentially because of that transnational. Now, are there US and others? I mean, I think we're kind of getting to kind of espionage and, insider threats and things like that. But those aren't specific to the country that they're, representing. Some of them are born there, of course, but some of them have been born or live in even other countries in general and just are part of that group.
Yeah. Can the U.S., and just to stick on Ukraine for one more, is this something that the U.S., and again, as Guy mentioned, some of this gets into some pretty, sensitive and potentially classified territory, but can the U.S. help an ally, in this case, Ukraine, defend itself, defend its own infrastructure, its cyber capabilities, if you will, from attacks from a Russian linked group or a ransomware group or what have you? Or is there stuff that you can do, that we, the U.S., can do to help allies in that regard, or are you kind of on your own when you're facing some of these threats?
I don't think necessarily you're on your own. I think this kind of plays, outside of cyber in general too. Is there are lines where you have allies that do support those operations. There's some things that you obviously can't, directly impact. But yeah, absolutely. We're providing, support in that space for Ukraine. Other countries are too, in trying to assist not only just physical military, but also the cyberspace as well. And our job at Lumifi is to kind of watch that information for countries of critical infrastructure, because a part of that transition too is they were taking a lot of looks at critical infrastructure and trying to take down countries that were supporting. I mean, Russia came out and said, if the United States enters the war, not only in a physical space, but also the cyberspace, that they were going to, retaliate from there. And that does happen. And it did happen. And so when you're kind of looking at that piece, like the Colonial Pipeline, for example, was another critical infrastructure that was a target. Those are spaces where not only is the United States helping our own, but we're also extending that arm to those countries in need.
Jonathan, I'm often trying to think the way our non-cyber world listeners might think. And I have a question for you. As a world traveling journalist, I oftentimes will get random text messages on my phone from unknown numbers, and it's often people who are sending me a PDF as if it's like an invitation. It must be an important file. Should I open it? Are we at the level with ransomware attacks that's actually a way to phish? And if just by opening something like that, could that give a hacker full-blown entree into everything on my phone?
Sure. So I don't know necessarily if it's a large vector for ransomware on a phone. I think what they're really looking for is our connection to work environments. And so when you're kind of logging in on your phone and you're connected to Outlook and Teams, Slack, Discord, and et cetera, those are really things that they're looking for. And so could that happen from a user account? Yeah, absolutely. They can phish your phone, get into your email. Would they care so much about your personal email? Probably not enough to do ransomware. You got to think of what they're really trying to do is they're trying to be activists either in the geopolitical space or financial gain. And you personally, as an individual, probably don't have that much financial gain unless you're like a Jeff Bezos, for example. And really, what they're looking for is the whole company takedown, not specifically to that CEO entity.
Johnathon Miller of Lumifi Cyber, thank you so much for joining us here in the Threat Status Podcast. Really appreciate it.
Thanks, Jonathan.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate it.
This episode of the Threat Status Weekly Podcast is brought to you by L3 Harris. Moving fast requires trust, and moving forward requires disruption. Explore their cutting-edge technologies currently in production and designed for today's fighter pilots by visiting l3harris.com. L3 Harris, power defense with the trusted disruptor.
And it's now time for Threats of the Week, our weekly segment on the show where Guy and I each identify a threat, whether it's here at home, domestically, or in some corner of the world that we think is impacting U.S. national security right now, this week, as you all are listening to the show. And Guy, my threat of the week is terror recruiting online, but specifically the use of AI and the emergence of something called composite violent extremism. David Gartenstein-Ross, a senior advisor on asymmetric warfare at the Foundation for Defense of Democracies, he testified at a House Homeland Security hearing this week that focused on the recruiting and radicalizing of terrorists online, and he described a troubling trend at the intersection of terrorism and AI. So he specifically talked about composite violent extremism, which, according to him, describes cases where individuals engage in or support acts of terrorism or targeted violence despite adhering to a mixture of ideological beliefs that don't fit neatly into one category of extremism. So these folks, as he describes them, are ideologically fluid extremists. They may have a host of grievances. They may not align with one group. They may be angry at governments or racial groups or women, for example, not one particular cause, set of political beliefs, or one specific religion. And that's terrifying because AI could allow extremist groups to essentially tailor content to a given individual. If you detect online that he's angry and could be prone to violence, you feed him AI-driven content that reinforces those violent tendencies that he might have. So does ISIS care exactly what a person believes, or do they just want him to blow up a shopping mall or drive his car into a crowd like we saw in New Orleans on New Year's Day? So it's my thread of the week, Guy, because it seems like we're at a potential inflection point in online terrorist recruiting that could put all of us at risk right now.
I think you're right on the money, Ben. And I'm actually going to piggyback off of you here for my own thread of the week, which is that the U.S. government's counter-extremism social media operation is in disarray at the start of the Trump presidency. Remember, Ben, that Republicans in Congress effectively gutted funding for the State Department's Global Engagement Center, the GEC, as it's known in national security lingo. That was a key node of such counter-messaging operations. We're talking multilingual U.S. officials trying to call out BS of ISIS propaganda accounts on social media in multiple languages around the world. Now, with the fight that President Trump has launched against essentially all U.S. foreign aid, some of which also intersects with such counter-extremist programs in places like North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, and Southeast Asia. My thread of the week is that the world is in a heyday moment for extremist terror groups to spread their message, brainwash, and recruit very young potential followers by showing up on those potential followers' cell phone social media accounts.
Yeah, look, Robert Greenway of the Heritage Foundation last week said he sees the terror threat right now to the U.S. at its highest point in more than 30 years. And you do some quick math. That, of course, includes 9/11. So that's a pretty terrifying thing to think about right now. So thank you so much for that, Guy. Thank you for joining me. Big thanks again to Johnathon Miller from Lumifi Cyber for joining us here on the show. And a big thank you to all of you, our listeners. Please go ahead, hit that subscribe button, share with all of your friends, and Guy and I will be back next week on the Threat Status Podcast.